In this episode, we're going to learn how to tell supply chain attacks apart by focusing on three patterns that show up again and again: a vendor breach, dependency poisoning, and trust abuse. Supply chain incidents can feel especially unsettling to beginners because they attack something you normally treat as safe by default, like a partner you pay, a software update you install, or a package your developers rely on. When the supply chain is involved, the attacker is not necessarily breaking your front door. They may be walking through a side entrance that you intentionally left open because you need it for business. That creates a special kind of risk, because the very things that help you move faster, like third-party services and shared components, also create shared weakness. The good news is that you can differentiate these attacks by learning what the attacker compromised and how trust was leveraged to reach you. Once you can name the pattern, you can also predict where to look next and what kind of impact is likely. To start, let's define supply chain in a way that fits cybersecurity rather than shipping and warehouses. In security, the supply chain is the set of outside parties, products, components, and services you depend on to build, run, and support your own systems. That includes technology vendors you buy software from, service providers who run part of your environment, and even open-source components that get pulled into your code. It also includes indirect dependencies, where you depend on a vendor who depends on another vendor, which can be hard to see. The core issue is that supply chain relationships create trust links, and trust links create access. You might trust a vendor's update system to deliver safe software, or you might trust a partner's identity system to allow a connection, or you might trust a package repository to provide legitimate libraries. Attackers target those trust links because they can bypass your defenses by entering through something you already accept. So the central skill is recognizing which trust link was abused. A vendor breach is one of the most familiar supply chain patterns, and it usually means a third-party organization you rely on was compromised, and that compromise affected you. The vendor might be a managed service provider, a payroll provider, a customer support platform, or a software company whose product you use. In a vendor breach, the attacker compromises the vendor's environment, then uses the vendor's access to reach customer environments or customer data. Sometimes the vendor itself holds customer data, so the impact is direct data exposure without the attacker needing to touch the customer environment at all. Other times, the vendor has privileged access into the customer environment for support or administration, and the attacker uses that access for intrusion. The key differentiation clue is that the initial compromise happened in the vendor, and your organization is downstream. You might notice unusual activity from the vendor's known network locations or known service accounts, or you might receive a notification that the vendor had an incident and you need to take action. In this pattern, your trust in the vendor's operational security becomes the weakness the attacker exploited. Dependency poisoning is a different pattern, and it lives in the world of software components that get reused and assembled like building blocks. Modern software is rarely written from scratch. It is built from packages, libraries, and modules that are pulled from public or private repositories. Dependency poisoning means an attacker manages to get a malicious or tampered component into that dependency stream. So when you build or update software, you accidentally bring the attacker in with it. This can happen by publishing a malicious package with a name that looks legitimate, by compromising a maintainer account, or by injecting malicious code into an update that appears normal. The key clue is that the attacker is not targeting your organization directly at first. They are targeting the ecosystem that feeds software into many organizations. The impact can be widespread because many teams may automatically download the poison dependency during builds. Another clue is that the malicious code may run inside your environment under the identity of the software that imported it, which can make it look like trusted application behavior. When you differentiate dependency poisoning, you focus on the component pathway, not a single vendor's network. Trust abuse is the broad third category, and it describes incidents where the attacker does not necessarily compromise the vendor's entire organization or poison a public dependency ecosystem, but instead abuses a trust relationship that exists between systems. Trust relationships are everywhere: a partner connection that allows access, an integration that uses an access key, an update channel that delivers signed software, or a support relationship that grants remote access. Trust abuse can mean the attacker steals an integration key, compromises a trusted account, or tricks a process into accepting something it should not. One example is stealing a code signing certificate or abusing a signing process so malicious software looks legitimate. Another example is taking over a trusted support account so the attacker's activity looks like authorized vendor maintenance. A third example is abusing identity federation, where one organization accepts identity assertions from another, which can become an entry point if the asserting side is compromised. The key clue in trust abuse is that the attacker's actions are accepted because they resemble a trusted workflow, not because the attacker broke an obvious barrier. Differentiating this category requires you to ask what trust link allowed the attacker's access to be treated as normal. Now let's make the differences sharper by comparing what the attacker is actually compromising in each case. In a vendor breach, the attacker compromises the vendor's environment, which can include their internal systems, support tools, or customer-facing services. In dependency poisoning, the attacker compromises the component supply chain, such as a repository, a maintainer account, or the build pipeline that produces a commonly used library. In trust abuse, the attacker compromises a trust mechanism itself, like keys, certificates, accounts, or federation connections, and then uses that mechanism to pass as legitimate. These are related, but the focus differs. Vendor breach is about a specific third party. Dependency poisoning is about reusable code components. And trust abuse is about the authentication and assurance layer that makes something appear safe. If you listen carefully, you can often classify an incident just by hearing where the first compromise occurred and how legitimacy was faked. That classification matters because it changes what evidence you prioritize and what containment steps you take. Impact also differs across these categories, even though there can be overlap. Vendor breaches often lead to exposure of data that the vendor holds, and they can also lead to intrusion into customer environments using vendor-provided access. The scale can be large because one vendor may have many customers, and the timing can be messy because customers may only learn about the breach after the vendor discovers it. Dependency poisoning often leads to compromised software running inside your environment, which can create stealthy persistence, data theft, or internal lateral movement. The scale can be broad across many organizations, but the impact on any one organization depends on where the poison dependency was used and what permissions it had. Trust abuse can lead to targeted high-impact outcomes, like attackers pushing malicious updates, accessing partner systems, or impersonating trusted support activity. It can also be especially hard to detect because the attacker's actions may be signed, authenticated, or otherwise validated by systems that normally guard against outsiders. So while all three are supply chain issues, the typical damage and detection challenges vary. Beginners often get tripped up by the idea that supply chain attacks are always about software updates, but that is only one slice of the story. A vendor breach can be about a service provider that handles billing or customer communication, and the attacker may never touch your code at all. Dependency poisoning can occur in internal components too, such as private packages shared across teams, not just public open-source projects. Trust abuse can involve people and processes, like a vendor help desk being tricked into resetting an account, or a partner accepting a connection because it matches expected authentication patterns. This is why the trust lens is so helpful. It makes you look for the moment where something untrusted was treated as trusted. That moment can be a signed update, a trusted API key, a remote support session, or an automated integration. When you train your mind to spot that acceptance moment, you become faster at differentiating what kind of supply chain incident you are seeing. A simple way to practice differentiation is to imagine the attacker's objective and what shortcut the supply chain provides. If the attacker wants broad reach, dependency poisoning is attractive because one poison component can spread widely through automated builds and updates. If the attacker wants a high-value set of customers or a specific industry, a vendor breach is attractive because a single vendor can act as a gateway to many customers in that niche. If the attacker wants to bypass defenses and avoid suspicion, trust abuse is attractive because it lets them operate under a cloak of legitimacy, such as signed code or trusted service accounts. The attacker's choice often reflects a trade-off between effort and payoff, and the supply chain provides a path that reduces effort by leveraging existing trust. For defenders, understanding that trade-off helps you anticipate what the attacker might have done first and what evidence might exist. It also helps you communicate risk clearly, because you can explain that the incident is not random but an exploitation of a known trust relationship. Even at a beginner level, it is valuable to understand why supply chain attacks are so hard to handle emotionally, because they challenge the idea of control. People feel like they can control their own passwords and firewalls, but they feel less control over what a vendor does or what an open-source maintainer might accidentally publish. Attackers exploit that feeling by creating doubt and delay, which leads to slow response. The healthier mindset is to accept that external dependencies are part of modern operations and that trust must be managed, not assumed. Managing trust means knowing what you depend on, limiting the privileges of those dependencies, and monitoring for abnormal behavior even when it comes from trusted sources. You do not need to distrust everything. You need to avoid blind trust. Differentiating vendor breach, dependency poisoning, and trust abuse is a step toward that mature posture because it turns a scary concept into recognizable patterns you can respond to. As we close, the key idea is that supply chain attacks are attacks on trust pathways, and your job is to identify which trust pathway was abused. Vendor breach is when a specific third party you rely on is compromised, and that compromise flows downstream to you through shared access or shared data. Dependency poisoning is when a reusable software component is tampered with or replaced so that your own systems import malicious behavior during normal development or update processes. Trust abuse is when the attacker compromises or manipulates a trust mechanism, like keys, certificates, accounts, or federated identity, so their actions are accepted as legitimate. Once you can differentiate these, you can stop describing supply chain incidents as mysterious and start describing them as concrete patterns with predictable next questions. The more clearly you can label the pattern, the faster you can decide what to contain, what to verify, and what to communicate. That clarity is exactly what you need for confident decision-making in the GCIL incident handling mindset.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.